All right, you guys know I will always keep it real with you. And lately, I've been thinking a lot about how life never really matches up with the timeline that we once pictured, right? I remember being younger and imagining what my life would look like at this moment in time. Career, relationships, maybe even how I felt about myself as an individual. And yeah, some of it is there, but other parts? Not even close, if I'm being honest. And for a while, that gap between the expectation and the reality, it made me feel like I had somehow fallen behind. Add in becoming a parent, changing career paths, and the everyday pressure of just keeping up with everything. And with all that, my mental health, honestly, it took a hit. And for the longest time, I avoided therapy because I thought that it would take too much time or that I'd have to start over every time I met someone new. But now I realize that having someone in your corner who can listen and who really asks the right questions and can help you see things differently, it's huge. And that's why I love today's sponsor, BetterHelp. They make starting therapy easier. You just fill out an easy questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist in as little as just a couple of days, and if it's not the right fit, you can switch therapists at any time at no extra cost. And with over 7,000 reviews and a rating of 4.3 on Trustpilot, it's a platform that you can trust. So click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/10tolife and get 10% off your first month of therapy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. The case we're talking about today is one that we briefly talked about in the past when it first broke, but there weren't really a lot of details. There was some stuff that was a little just like murky and unclear. However, since then, a lot more details have come to light. Not only have we been able to request a lot of the legal filings and a lot of the information, but just more time has passed since the initial case, and so there's more information out there. But I want to give you guys a warning that it's a case that has to do with a child, so it's definitely not easy, not that any of them are, but this one is especially difficult, so just a little bit of a trigger warning. And it's the case of Athena Brownfield. So guys, let's jump right in. Athena Brownfield was born on September 6, 2018 in Lawton, Oklahoma. Her parents' names were Jasmine and Wesley, and she was the youngest of two kids. Her older sister, Adina, was a year older than her. Now, Athena loved playing dress up with her sister. She loved to color. She was just like a girly girl through and through, and she was kind of like a little tiny artist in a way. Her favorite show was also Baby Shark, and she could just honestly sit and watch it for what seemed like for hours. And Adina and Athena were absolutely best friends. They stuck by each other's side. They had a very close relationship, just like two best friends who were sisters. They were also so close in age, as I mentioned, so they just really bonded together. And it also didn't help that they were really the only stable, consistent people in each other's lives. Now, although Athena loved all of the typical things that a 4-year-old little girl would love to do and seemed to also live a pretty normal life to those who, are on the outside looking in, what turned out to be a very short life for her was actually full of turmoil and instability from the very beginning. Now, let me start by saying this. The two girls' parents weren't exactly strangers to law enforcement. I mean, they spent most of their time in and out of jail. They also struggled with mental illness, apparently, and they had struggled with that for years. So it's said that really it's only something that got worse as time went on. And I'm assuming that maybe it was from the inability to get proper care to treat it, and that's why it escalated. So because of their own struggles and their own issues, Adina and Athena both didn't spend much time with their biological parents. In fact, they ended up not even being in the care of them for most of the large majority of their lives. And when both of the girls were just barely toddlers, the mother, Jasmine, decided that she wasn't able to take proper care of both of them anymore. So she ended up making plans for them to go live with a family member. And I want to just touch on that because just by hearing that first sentence, you might think that it sounds pretty responsible and that it was like this selfless act made by Jasmine and that she realized she couldn't care for her girls. She had a family member step in and take over for her. But the more that we get into it, I think that you'll see just how irresponsible and careless this whole decision truly was. Jasmine felt like she wasn't going to be able to raise the girls, and that was for a lot of different reasons. And she claimed that she also didn't want to leave them in the care of their biological father, Wesley, due to his sketchy history. He had some abuse allegations, his mental illness, just, a checkered past. So that's why she made the decision to leave the girls in the care of her family member, a cousin named Alysia. Now, Alysia seemed to have everything together, or at least more than, her cousin Jasmine did. She was married to her husband Ivan, and the two of them lived in Oklahoma as well. They too had 4 children together. So from the outside looking in, you would think that that would be the perfect setup for Athena and Adina, right? I mean, they'd have these 2 loving new parental type figures, parents in the home, also who happen to be family. They'd be able to grow up alongside their cousins, similar in ages, play, hopefully be able to live a more normal and routine and structured life. Now, this wasn't a short-term placement either, because the girls ended up living in this family's home for at least 2 entire years. Now, with them being only 4 and 5 years old at the time of the incident that we're going to get into, they pretty much had been completely raised by these people. So they didn't call them, Uncle Ivan or Alysia or anything like that. They just called them mom and dad. That's what they looked at them as. But no matter how ideal the situation sounded, it was pretty much a mess from the very start. Now, Jasmine, the biological mother, she hadn't really thought anything out further than just making sure that her daughters had a roof over their heads. She didn't put much thought into anything else. And Adina, who was 5 years old, hadn't even been enrolled in kindergarten or even preschool. That's because her mother, Jasmine, never sent any of the proper documentation that needed to go whenever you sign a kid up for school. History, emergency contact, vaccination records, all of those things. And along those same lines, neither of the girls had ever gone to the doctor for any kinds of checkups, for booster vaccines, for physicals. So it was all kind of a gray area. And although Alysia and Ivan were taking care of the girls and were technically their guardians, they didn't have any type of actual legal guardianship over the girls. Jasmine had left a handwritten note when she first dropped the girls off, kind of explaining that she was leaving them in Alysia's care willingly in case there was ever a question or a need, but that was kind of it. It was never official. There was never actual official documentation, which I don't really know how you would do that unless you go through the court system or unless you do a handwritten letter and you have it notarized or something just to make it seem more legal and legit. I don't know. But as you can imagine, handwritten notes won't really get you very far as proper documentation is concerned. And basically, after she dropped them off and waved goodbye, Jasmine just had very little to do with them. She hadn't even spoken to either one of the girls in about 8 or 9 months prior to the incident that we're going to talk about. Holidays and birthdays were quiet. She never reached out. And the last time that Jasmine even spoke to either one of them was just through a phone call. And they had apparently shown very little interest or care, which realistically, they probably didn't even understand who she was or why she was calling them and why she wanted to talk with them. They had lived at this house now for years. Their core memories growing up would be in that house. Even my kids, I have a 3.5 and a 5-year-old, and sometimes when I ask them about if they remember somebody or an old babysitter or something like that from 2 years ago even, or old schoolmates from their old school, usually they don't because they're at such a young age that, sometimes they remember certain things, but it's often times that they don't. So the whole situation had kind of become this really easy way out. She didn't have to parent anymore. She hardly ever found the time to call. She never visited with them. And she also never provided Alysia and Ivan with any sort of money for the girls, despite knowing that they had now gone from 4 little mouths to feed to 6. Now, I also have to mention, it hasn't really been a topic of conversation about what Ivan or Alysia did for work. It's been said that Ivan did serve in the Marines at one point, but that's kind of it. And what was a huge topic of conversation, however, was a TikTok account that was run by Alysia, because her bio claimed that she was this beauty influencer. Though, I'm not trying to throw shade, but to be honest, there really aren't a lot of, makeup videos on there. It didn't really seem like that was the case. But her biological children were shown a lot in some of these videos for just short periods of time, here and there. But what was interesting was Adina and Athena never made an appearance. Not at all. Not throughout her aspiring career of beauty influencer, TikToker, which ended up having about 3,000 followers. But the other kids would come in and out of the videos, but Adina and Athena never would. Now, regardless, January 10th, 2023 was the beginning of what would become a massive headline news story and truly a heartbreaking discovery. Because on that day, a postal worker was just doing their normal routine, just kind of delivering the mail, when they noticed a young child outside wandering alone. Now, this child was 5-year-old Adina. And the postal workers' red flags immediately started going up, right? I mean, first of all, it was a very cold day in January. And even without knowing her exact age, it was pretty apparent that this little girl was too small, too little to just be walking around outside in the cold by herself. And I gotta say, this post worker was like some kind of guardian angel, like a different type of guardian angel, because they listened to their gut and they decided to approach this little girl and to also call the authorities, which it never hurts to have somebody just check. And especially that proved to be true in this case, right? Because what started as a quick call down to the local police station before continuing their mail route, it was literally what led to a massive discovery and possibly even saved Adina's life. When the postal worker approached her and asked Adina, what are you doing outside? What's going on? She said that she was hungry. She said that she was tired of being alone, and she also said that she missed her sister. Now, not knowing anything about the situation or the background, the worker basically just kept talking to her, made sure that she was safe until the authorities would come in and take over. But they knew that something was wrong. And what the authorities discovered when they finally arrived at the home of 225 West Nebraska Avenue, it was shocking, to say the least. It turns out that Adina had told this worker that, like I said, she was tired of being alone, and the reason she said that is because she was exactly that. She was alone. Although it wasn't something that they discovered until a little bit later, but Ivan had fled the state, and he had taken his 4 biological children with him. They fled from Oklahoma to Arizona. Meanwhile, Alysia, the mother of those children, had been on, quote, a romantic getaway with a new man entirely, a guy named Blayton Davis. And she had been gone from this house for almost an entire week. So the fact that a 5-year-old had been left completely home alone was, of course, a huge concern in and of itself, but even more concerning was the fact that she was also saying she missed her sister. Little 4-year-old Athena was nowhere to be found. So it was clear that there was a huge amount of neglect happening inside this home, and this wasn't at all what anyone was expecting when that post office worker had called the police station that day.
First thing goes through my mind, kid got out of the house, playing in the street, playing in the yard. Parents probably didn't realize that the kid had got outside. Typically, that's the case whenever somebody sees a child outside. And then shortly after, I realized that we had a more serious situation. Nobody was around, no parents, no other kids, so then I realized that we had a more serious situation. And then once I realized the seriousness of it was out of our hands as far as resources go, that's when I asked OSBI to come down and assist us with it.
So Athena was named a missing person, and searches began almost immediately for her. And think about it, if Adina had been outside alone in the freezing temperatures, who was to say that Athena hadn't followed her outside and then maybe even gotten lost somewhere? The authorities assumed that in their search that the 2 girls had probably both been left home alone, which meant that Athena could have been missing for hours or worse, even days, and all of it would have been really difficult to tell. So they searched everywhere. They searched every neighborhood, every abandoned building, every abandoned home, hoping she would turn up somewhere. They were searching everywhere so much so that trash in the town was even temporarily stopped, hoping that maybe there would be some sort of clue within that, which, not to be grim, but the clue within that would have been if Athena's body had been left in a random bin somewhere. Now, something that really set people off was the fact that an Amber Alert was never issued for Athena. A missing and endangered person alert was sent out, but those two things are very, very different because an Amber Alert has a much higher reach, while a missing and endangered person alert will just send out the notification to those people who are local to it. And I understand that, yes, there are certain guidelines that need to be met in order to send out an alert, but also a missing child is a missing child. And if there are signs of neglect and her sister, who is also a 5-year-old, by the way, was also left home alone for a week, in my opinion, that warrants the extra alert. Especially since a local alert would really do no good if somebody had taken her to another state at this point. Everyone in town could be searching, yes, but nothing would come from it if she was completely gone and if she wasn't even in town. The missing and endangered person alert only went out to a 15-mile radius, which, again, does not seem like enough at all. The local authorities, though, claimed that the news outlets and the social media activity regarding the case made up for it and that would kind of make up the difference, but I don't see how. I can't really help but question if it really did.
To answer the Amber Alert question, there have been a lot of questions on the Amber Alert. The Amber Alert has specific guidelines that we have to adhere to push out the Amber Alert specifically. The Amber Alert goes out nationwide. So once we push that button, it goes all the way to Washington, D.C. and goes out like that. So there's specific things and guidelines that we have to follow. Not every part of that guideline came into play in this. And so that wasn't done. So the next best thing that we could do was a missing and endangered notification. That went out in a 15-mile radius in around where we knew that the person was missing. And so that's why you didn't get it statewide. Those emergency alerts didn't go statewide. It went locally, and that was really the important time frame that we needed to get that out. And it was pushed on social media. All of the news outlets were able to get that immediately. And so it was done in a very efficient way by guidelines. And there are reasons for those guidelines. The Department of Justice puts out those guidelines to help us put that together. And so that's kind of the answer on that.
Now remember, we know now that Athena and Adina were in the care of Alysia and Ivan, but again, none of that was legally declared in a court of law. So when the authorities first realized that Athena was missing and that Adina was just alone wandering outside, they had no idea the background situation of it all. So here they had a missing child that they were looking for, the biological parents that they were looking for, and Alysia and Ivan that they were looking for. It was just a hot mess. They had no answers and they were trying to figure out what was going on. Which luckily, it didn't take too long for the investigators to locate Alysia, and they arrested her 2 days after this incident, which was January 12th, 2023. They had arrested her and charged her with 2 counts of child neglect. But this was going to end up being, honestly, like the least of her concerns in the long run. Alysia was the only person who had been taken into custody at that point, which the media wasn't sure at the time if either one of Athena's biological parents or even Ivan would receive any repercussions for what had happened to her or what was unknown to have happened. So Alysia's bond was set at $500,000. But Athena was still a missing person, and searches were all turning up empty. So with each hour and day that passed, the community, truthfully, was filled with less and less hope, knowing that if a 4-year-old was exposed to the harsh January elements, especially without the proper clothing on, without an adult with her, she had very little chance of survival. And that's taking into account if foul play wasn't even involved here. So what Alysia told the detectives after her arrest was honestly far from what anyone was expecting. And to be honest, it was even worse than anyone could have imagined, because it changed the whole way that they even were looking at this case. After her arrest, Alysia confessed to everything that she claimed to have known. And it was far from just I don't even want to say simple, but like basic case of neglect, if you can even call it that. But Alysia confessed to the detectives that on Christmas Day in 2022, a month earlier, that she witnessed what she believed was Athena's murder. And I want to give another trigger warning here, because this next part that Alysia tells the police is absolutely awful and seriously just unthinkable. But on Christmas Day at around midnight, Alysia told detectives that Ivan had gotten angry at Athena. So in a fit of rage, he began beating her. She claimed that she witnessed him holding her up by her arms before then laying her onto the ground and hitting her in the chest 3 times. And after those 3 times, she said Athena didn't move. Her eyes were hardly open, and she knew in her gut that she was probably gone. Now, this whole incident took place in the matter of just an hour, because then Alysia told the detectives that by 1 a.m., Ivan left with Athena's body, and Alysia never saw Athena again. Which this part absolutely infuriates me, not that the whole thing doesn't, but this infuriates me because if what she was confessing to was true, then instead of calling the police as soon as Ivan left, as soon as she couldn't feel like she was in danger anymore, which would have been literally the perfect time, and instead of being concerned for Athena or the other 5 children's safety, instead of stopping Ivan while he was home, she just did nothing. Literally did nothing. She sat at the house and just waited for Ivan to come back, like he had gone to the grocery store or he went out to pick up milk or cigarettes or something like that. And she claimed to have seen firsthand the lack of care for an innocent human, an innocent little 4-year-old girl's life. Literally, a little kid, a little girl who wouldn't and couldn't hurt a fly and had never done anything wrong in her entire life. And she didn't even consider for a second the danger that she was also putting her other children into. So I don't care what she says or what her excuse is in all of this. If Ivan was capable of doing that to Athena, damn right he was capable of doing it to any of the other children in that house. You don't just heal and change and rehabilitate in 2 hours from something as evil and deranged as that. Like it was some simple mistake, like you accidentally knocked a vase over or something. So when Ivan finally came back in the early morning hours, it really solidified the fact that Alysia was just as involved as Ivan. Apparently, Ivan told her that he had taken Athena's body to their old property in Rush Springs, and Rush Springs is about a 30-minute drive from where they were in Oklahoma. So Alysia's account of the time frame of all of this, based on cell phone data and activity that they later would track, it just didn't match. It was way off, which I'm going to get into in a little bit more here, but the stories already were not aligning. And the reason that I said that it solidified Alysia being just as guilty as Ivan is because when he came back home, he told her exactly where he buried Athena's body. She claimed that he had buried her in the backyard of their old home near a fence line. And just to make sure that he knew the exact location, should he ever need to know it for whatever reason in the future, he told her that he put a large branch that had broken off a nearby tree right on top of the burial site. So this sweet, innocent little girl who trusted him, trusted both of them, and called them mom and dad, was brutally murdered and thrown into the ground with less humility and care than a typical house pet would receive when you do like a yard burial for them. Just buried, forgotten, throw a branch on top of it. And Alysia had days and weeks to come forward to the police and tell them everything she knew. But instead, she just kept posting TikToks, kept trying to be an influencer, kept trying to get famous. And I think what's even more infuriating is that she was starting this whole new relationship as well. She was going on dates, she was spending weekends with this man, acting like nothing was wrong, as if she had no clue, no idea that just weeks prior, an innocent child had died while in her care. Which I can only imagine what this man thought when he heard the news about her. I mean, can you imagine? So after learning all of this information about a potential burial site, the search for little Athena turned into a search to recover her body. So not so much a rescue anymore, but more of a recovery. And that same day, an arrest warrant was filed for Ivan. And based on the fact that Athena had still not been found and the confession from Alysia, they believed that they had every bit of probable cause to arrest him on first-degree murder charges. And when Ivan was finally arrested, he was still in Phoenix with his 4 biological kids. He was booked in Phoenix and then waited to be extradited back to Oklahoma. When the news broke, the whole community was absolutely shocked to learn what Alysia and Ivan were accused of. And we all know, as true crime junkies, true crime consumers, that it's usually the people that you would least expect. But to the people who knew them closest, they just couldn't believe it. Everyone just thought that they didn't fit the stereotype, the type of person and type of people who could even think about hurting a child, especially when they had 4 children of their own.
And he brought 2 kids with him a lot of the times, 1 or 2 kids to work, and they helped him, and there was never, he didn't even raise his voice. I've talked to him several times, I've seen him interacting. He was very quiet and shy, but never raised his voice really. But I never felt like he was anybody that was capable of this. Never. I would have never guessed that. He gave me a ride one time or 2 times maybe, and I'd never felt uncomfortable around him. He didn't even talk really, He was just pretty quiet, but he was really nice, docile.
A few days later, on January 17th, the news finally broke that nobody wanted to hear. Remains had officially been found on the property that Alysia gave to the authorities. And those remains were believed to be that of 4-year-old Athena. Court documents later showed that her body was found inside a backpack that was then later buried on the property. And the remains were positively identified through DNA as belonging to Athena. Now, as upsetting as this whole thing was, her autopsy report came back, and that is what really blew everyone away, because it showed a huge contradiction to what Alysia had confessed to, what she had said happened. It seemed like even though Alysia had, weeks to plan what she would do if she was ever caught and a story to come up with, she was too busy going on these romantic getaways and making her TikToks to really even get her story straight. She had told the police that Athena had been killed from Ivan's physical abuse that night. But when the autopsy report came back, It showed that Athena's death had unfortunately been a long time coming, dating back much, much farther than just Christmas night. Athena's cause of death had absolutely nothing to do with any extreme physical abuse or blunt force trauma that Alysia claimed she had faced that night. But instead, her cause of death was described as acute pneumonia complicating nutrition. That is the direct quote. Athena's tiny body was under the 3rd percentile for all of the weight and for stature, weight for age, weight for growth chart. You know, when you're raising a child and they tell you what percentile you're in, she was under the 3rd%, under 3%. And that's not even all of it. She was only 23 pounds when she died, which for a 4-year-old is absolutely insane. My 4-year-old, he literally stepped on the scale a few days ago. He's 46 pounds. She was 23 pounds, half his weight. And the average is at least double. So you think of this 4-year-old who weighs, my 3.5-year-old even weighs more than that. She weighs 32 pounds, I think, or 31. So this 4-year-old is weighing, what, that of a 2-year-old? The screening of her body also showed that pneumonia wasn't the only sickness that Athena was fighting off. There were also traces of human endinovirus, rhinovirus, human bocavirus, and COVID. She was so sick and so malnourished that her body literally had no chance of fighting off any of these infections, none of these illnesses with proper care, which she of course wasn't getting. And my opinion and my assumption with the discrepancy between Alicia's story and how Athena actually passed away is that the truth of it all makes her look much more guilty. Not that witnessing a murder and not calling it in doesn't make you guilty, that of course does as well, but at least with her story, it was never her physically doing any harm to Athena. The actual death was blamed on Ivan. However, malnutrition, that shows that her caretaker was severely neglecting her for a very long time and was still being harmed even if it wasn't from these actual physical blows to her body. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this case has caused a slew of controversy, and I can't wait to hear your opinions on it. The main point of the controversy was whether or not Athena's biological parents should have been held accountable for what happened to her, which I think most of us can agree that we wouldn't do the same thing that Jasmine did. We wouldn't just drop our child off and book it and leave. But the legality of it all was highly questioned the first few months after Athena died. It was almost like there was this gray area that they were working within. Many people felt that Jasmine should be charged and is responsible for Athena's death, even if she wasn't literally involved and hadn't seen her for months prior. But technically, there are no laws that say you can't give your children to a caregiver. A huge complication with that arises, though, because most guardianships are settled through the state for obvious reasons. So Jasmine would have had to provide things like the necessary documents for the girls to go to school or go to the doctor. And, without legal guardianship declared to somebody else, that all still technically falls back on her. And as Athena and Adina's legal guardian, she was, of course, first and foremost, and above everything else, obviously supposed to keep them from harm, too.
Ultimately, you as the parent have the responsibility as that parent legally responsible for your child, and you have to make safe decisions for your child. Ideally, if you're going to have a child that's out of your home for a significant amount of time, you would go through the court and give a legal guardianship to somebody.
Now, obviously, it's very common for kids to get placed with family members. So there could have been a chance that if everything was done correctly and legally, that Adina and Athena could have still been in the care of Alysia and Ivan, just like Jasmine wanted them to be. But the huge difference is that the state would have been aware of this. So they could have gotten the proper medical care, and Adina could have already been enrolled in school, and there might have been possible caseworker checkups, and Athena's death was no accident. So I'm not saying that it could have been prevented either way, but maybe it would have at least, at the very least, motivated Ivan and Alysia to take better care of the girls. At the very best, maybe they could have completely avoided Athena's death if they knew that somebody was going to be keeping tabs on them, if somebody was going to be checking in and keeping tabs on the girls' welfare. Which I get it. There are so many what-ifs to this case that we really could go back and forth all day on it, but it does make you wonder. So when the authorities first realized that Athena was missing, the police apparently questioned both Jasmine and Wesley, and they were both cooperative. Those are the biological parents. The status of their relationship wasn't really reported, although it's assumed that they were, of course, no longer together because Wesley's mother later spoke out to the press and claimed that Jasmine was kind of known to have kept the girls away from him. But I don't even think the dynamic or their relationship really even matters in the grand scheme of things. But Wesley was arrested in February of 2023, unrelated, but for failure to appear for an outstanding DUI warrant. However, he was never charged for anything in regards to neglect of any kind. And like we said earlier, the whole guardianship situation was kind of like an easy and, let's face it, selfish way out for Jasmine. Jasmine, however, was arrested on May 4th, 2023, and she was arrested on 2 counts of child neglect for both of the girls. She pled not guilty, and she's still going through the courts. Now, despite what she claimed to be her best efforts to give them a better life, and better than what she could provide for them, and give them stability and all of that, the responsibility to make sure that her children were in a safe environment, it still falls back on her. A simple note saying, here you go, I've given up guardianship, it doesn't make you any less liable for your kids anymore. And I'm just going to put that out there as a PSA for anybody who thinks they're going to just scribble down a note and leave their kids. You are still liable. It is not legal. You are still their guardian. Now, when we first talked about this case in January 2023, when it all first broke, we talked about how the court documents in Ivan's arrest warrant showed that, quote, evidence was found in the defendant's possession. And then the description underneath was listed as a cell phone. So it was still so early in the case that we weren't really entirely sure what that entailed or what it meant, just that the cell phone was listed as evidence. And it stayed that way, because not long after Alysia and Ivan were arrested, a gag order was placed on the case. Court documents related to the order showed all of the attorneys, all of the agents, and all of law enforcement could not release any comments or any information before any of the trials took place.
This is a gag order, and it was filed yesterday. It says that lawyers and law enforcement here in Caddo County cannot talk publicly about this case.
Gag orders are exceedingly rare, and they generally only occur in the most high-profile cases. 2 examples are the Oklahoma City bombing and then the Daniel Holtzclaw case.
Attorney Ed Blau told me a gag order on Athena Brownfield's case is serious. He says public interest is a big reason.
The most high-profile cases are the ones that people see when they turn on their TV, when they turn on the radio, and when they open Facebook or they open Twitter.
Blau says judges will issue these orders if they feel it could impact a defendant's right to a fair trial. Athena's case is getting international attention, specifically on social media.
If you see 15 posts from people you're friends with on Facebook all saying somebody is guilty, it's hard to say that that's not going to affect you on some level.
The goal is to keep a jury as unbiased as possible.
The reason why a judge does that or would do that is so eventually when a case got to a jury trial, hopefully not too many of the potential jurors will have heard so much about the case that they would have already formed an opinion about it.
It also means you won't hear from lawyers on either side. We won't be able to get information from any counsel in this case or law enforcement in Caddo County.
Now, I will say, before the gag order was placed, the media was able to report a little bit more information regarding that cell phone and the cell phone records, which gives us a clue as to what exactly that evidence connected to him might be. Now, remember, when Alysia first confessed, she told the investigators about that incident when Ivan began physically harming Athena and how that happened around midnight, and then he left their home at around 1 a.m. Well, his phone records show that he didn't arrive at the property in Rush Springs until about 4:45 or 5:15 a.m. in that window. But from their address to Rush Springs, as I said, it's only a 30-minute drive. So that leaves a huge amount of time unaccounted for. What was really happening between when he left at 1 a.m. and when he arrived in Rush Springs at 4:45 a.m.? What was happening in that window of time? Unless, of course, Alysia had been lying, and they had actually both spent those hours coming up with a plan and coming up with a story together. We already know she was lying about how Athena had actually died, so who's to say she wasn't lying about the timestamps either? It seemed so far, at least in my opinion, and to me, like Alysia has had more involvement but has been trying to downplay it, trying to blame Ivan for everything. However, I want to know what you think about all of that. But anyway, I'm assuming that the evidence was that his cell phone placed him at the crime scene and at the burial site. However, there still could be more evidence, and important evidence that would make them want to have a gag order, such as confessions, pictures, videos. We just aren't aware of all of that yet. Then, in December of 2023, the charges against both Alysia and Ivan were changed. Ivan had originally been charged with first-degree murder, but after the autopsy report came back and it showed that the cause of death was not from physical abuse, it was downgraded to second-degree murder. He's also being charged with child neglect for Athena as well as unlawful removal of a body. Now, instead of Alysia's charges being downgraded, she's now facing first-degree murder charges, as well as obstruction of an officer for lying about what happened to Athena on Christmas night. And the reason for Alysia's charges being changed from neglect to first-degree murder is that the prosecution believes that she was the main cause of Athena's death. There's still not a whole lot of in-depth information out there, but new information is circulating that Alysia, unfortunately, took a direct play right out of, Vander Ark's book. If you remember Shonda Vander Ark, the freaking monster mother who made her child eat hot sauce and all of this stuff. Because it's believed that she would actually keep Athena locked inside of a closet for extended periods of time. And she purposefully didn't feed her, and she didn't give her proper nutrition, and we also obviously know that she didn't give her the proper health care that she needed. Which, speaking of Monster Vander Ark, and if you aren't familiar with that case, massive trigger warning, I will link it for you, but it is horrific and god-awful. But it's important to note that there were rumors in the media circulating that Athena was on the autism spectrum. Even now, over a year later, that bit of information was never confirmed or denied. But in the initial search for Athena, the investigators did release that she had limited verbal skills. Which, that of course doesn't necessarily mean that she was on the spectrum. I'm not sure with her lack of health care if she would have ever even had the opportunity to be diagnosed. But also, she clearly wasn't in school, she wasn't in pre-K, she wasn't getting attention, so I think her limited vocabulary could be attributed to that as well. I don't think you have to automatically jump to autism. Now, due to these amended charges, their preliminary hearings were waived, and all in all, everything was kept as quiet as possible in this case, due to Alysia and Ivan's lawyers wanting a fair trial. And there were also talks about a change of venue, but as quiet as the legal side of things were, Alysia still managed to be headlining news, yet it was nothing related to Athena's case. In February of 2024, Alysia had to be moved out of the facility that she was in and into a completely different one, and this was because of a possible, quote, inappropriate sexual relationship with one of the detention officers. Apparently, the situation was brought to the attention of the sheriff by a few of the other detention officers at that facility, and they claimed that they had grown suspicious of their dynamic, of their relationship, which I'm sure by things that they might have seen or heard throughout the jail or witnessed, who really knows, but seems like she was getting it on with one of the guards. The officer's name wasn't released, but we do know that the officer had only worked at that jail for about 6 months, so his career was pretty short-lived, to say the least. And under the Oklahoma Prison Rape Elimination Act, sexual conduct with an inmate is illegal, and it's considered assault. So the sheriff immediately fired him, though he wouldn't say to the media whether or not they actually had intercourse. So I don't know what really happened with that or if any charges may come with that, but no matter what happened, it was still clearly illegal. So good luck to him finding another job with that on his record. You are scum. Then on February 14th, 2024, a new court document was released. This document came from District Attorney Jason Hicks, and he filed this in regards to Alysia, and he was recommending that if she's found guilty, that she get the death penalty. The document reads that Alysia should be punished by death due to what they believed to be the following circumstances met. Quote, knowingly creating a great risk of death to more than one person, as well as, quote, the death of Athena Brownfield was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. So there was definitely some back and forth online about whether this case even qualified under the legal standards as being eligible for the death penalty, and some experts on the subjects said that this just isn't a typical death penalty case, which could then lead to complications. So the state and the DA argued that just because there wasn't physical harm in Athena's death, it doesn't mean, though, that it wasn't heinous, it wasn't atrocious, and it wasn't cruel. So because of that, it does qualify. The issue, though, with capital punishment cases is that the jury would have to find, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Alysia was responsible, as well as the fact that anything that happened in her personal life leading up to when Athena died didn't outweigh the facts of what happened. And I think we see in a lot of murder trials, the defense team will use a lot of explanations for their defendants' behaviors. And some of them can even be pretty persuasive, right? You often hear the sad stories of abandonment, of physical assault as a child, maybe even sexual issues as a child, which, yes, is incredibly sad. Don't get me wrong. But it does not justify growing up and committing a murder or mass neglect like she did, not in the slightest. And a legal expert weighed in on what we might expect to see in Alysia's trial, especially if the defense team was working against capital punishment charges. According to this expert, seeking the death penalty against women is pretty rare. But the jury actually ruling to give a woman the death penalty, that is even more rare. Most defense teams will err on the side of their defendant being a victim of abuse and neglect themselves, to try to pull at the heartstrings of the jury and make them question if the woman really felt like she had no choice, no other choice, I should say, due to her own abuse and what her own upbringing was. But I don't know if that argument always sticks. And if the defense decided to go with that argument, they might try to argue that Ivan was extremely abusive towards Alysia, whether physically, mentally, emotionally, arguing that Alysia fell victim to letting Athena's harm and abuse happen because she was afraid of what would have happened to her if she stood up to Ivan. And it's really messed up and it's frustrating, but it is smart on the defense's side because they know that it's very likely that at least one of the jurors will feel bad about the story that they're pushing and that they're selling, and that it may lead to an issue with the verdict. Eventually, there was a plea deal on the table. Alysia would plead guilty to first-degree murder, and in exchange, the DA would drop the death penalty request. And instead, they would ask for life without parole, and a judge would decide her sentence. But in November of 2024, Alysia backed out of that deal. She chose to go with the jury trial. So now the death penalty is a possibility again. Now, since Ivan's charges were downgraded to second-degree murder and child neglect, the DA will not be seeking the death penalty against him, either because the DA doesn't think that there's any way to argue that Ivan fit the circumstances required, or it could mean that he might be testifying in Alysia's trial. I don't know. They noted in a lot of these types of cases that the co-defendant will take a deal to save their own ass and will agree to testify in exchange for life in prison versus capital punishment, which we have definitely seen before and we know to be true, so we'll see what happens. Maybe that is the case here. But I'll be extremely curious to see how all of this plays out in court, especially since the amount of information that we really have at this point, even though we have more, it is limited compared to some of the other cases that we've covered. We've been able to get our hands on more information, but still not everything. I'm really wondering what that evidence with the cell phone is, because I don't think they would issue a gag order if it was simply about timestamps and about where his phone pinged. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not a legal expert. Go ask Emily Baker. Or maybe I will. Maybe I'll text her and ask her. But I don't know if they would do a gag order just for that, or if it's because they want the evidence, whether it's photos, videos, recordings, whatever it is, the communication back and forth between Alysia and Ivan, that maybe there was ongoing things happening in that house, which we do know to be true. Like maybe they were both complicit in it. We've seen parents and couples where they egg each other on and they send documentation of what's happening. So maybe that's why the gag order was issued, and that's why the cell phone is listed as evidence. I'm not sure. So although we have received a lot more information through the document poll and all of that, there's still that piece of it that's unclear to me that I'm going to want to see in the trial, which I hope to God there is not a lot of material like that on his phone, because that is just so cruel and disgusting. But I can't help but wonder what it is, why that, all of it. But I'm curious to know what you guys think. I know that this was an especially heavy one today. I appreciate you sticking with me. I hope that Athena's older sister, who just missed her younger sister, is in the care of someone who's treating her well and loves her and is taking care of her. And I can't even begin to imagine what that is like growing up. Losing your sister, your younger sister, missing her and knowing what happened and just walking around saying, I'm tired of being alone. I miss my sister. It's just so incredibly sad. Thank you guys so much. I will keep you posted on the trial and updates we have in this case. But until the next one, hold your babies if you have them and just stay safe.